It's time to do some pocket watching, as today we are going to be ranking all of the Pokemon Evil teams based on how well funded they are. Starting with the team with the least amount of money, Team Skull. There's no surprise here, Team Skull is just a bunch of rejects that banded together because most of them failed their island challenges. And in the game, they really didn't have a goal really, they just kind of blindly followed Guzma and most of their plans unironically just failed. And heck, even after they disbanded, most of them just went on to get regular jobs, and even Guzma in Pokemon Sun and Moon went back to his parents' house to stay there. And for those reasons alone, they are probably the least funded team out of all the teams. Coming up next in our category of 9 to 5, we have Team Yell. Team Yell suffers from the same stuff that Team Skull does, but the only difference is they're a bunch of town folk who probably work regular jobs, and on top of that, their leader is the Spikemas gym leader, Piers, who probably brings in a decent amount of money for the organization, but nothing crazy like the other ones above the list, so that's why they're basically placed in the regular 9 to 5 tier. Moving on to the small business tier. First entry, Team Star. I hate to say it, but Team Star is actually more funded than the Team Skull and Team Yell. They successfully operate multiple bases across the Paldea region, but you could argue that most of that funding comes from two people primarily, one being Penny, because she possessed the ability to hack into the Pokemon League's LP system and disperse currency to players and most likely Team Star members too. But by far, their most funding probably comes from Ortega, who is their engineer and mechanic who built all 5 of the Star Mobiles by himself. But he is the reason why Team Star has most of the funding, because he is a Nepo baby. Like, unironically, most of his money comes from the fact that his parents own the equivalent of like Louis Vuitton in Paldea. But with all that being said, that's the reason why I think they're a cut above Team Skull and Team Yell. It's just unironically they are a much more successful team for being a bunch of students, which should really tell you something about Team Skull and Team Yell. Moving on to the other team in this one, and this one might be a little controversial, but Team Aqua. See, they would be higher on the tier list, but by technicality, they're not really that well funded of a team, solely because most of their money comes from stealing. And you can argue that they should be in the same tier as Team Magma, as they were able to directly rival them in all of the games, but my argument for that is they just stole to get to where they were. They didn't really have that much money. They operate more like pirates than anything. And the biggest argument for Team Magma being in the next tier above Team Magma will come up later. But all I have to say is Team Magma's base is in the side of a volcano, while Team Aqua's base is just in a cave next to the ocean. And coming up next is the teams that probably have the money of like a small corporation, and this is where the tier list starts to really deviate from teams just being gangs to actually being organized teams. Starting off with Team Magma. See, what really puts them in this tier more than anything is that they are more organized than Team Aqua in my opinion. Like I said earlier, you can just look at their bases and tell that Team Magma has like slightly more going on if they drilled a wall into the side of a volcano, which does not sound cheap by any means. Not only that, but Maxie is also more organized and more calculated than his counterpart Archie, and generally makes better plans than him. So that's just about what separates them. Funding wise, I think there's not too much of a difference, except that maybe Team Magma has slightly more money because their base design. As for the next team, I think is Team Galactic. Team Galactic is actually arguably one of those teams that could definitely be on the highest tier on this list, but I think falls short just because of this competition. But Team Galactic honestly doesn't really do much in the games. I mean, whenever they do it very calculated. Like, everything is very accounted for with Team Galactic, very organized and very structured. And this can definitely be shown in the leader Cyrus, as when you first encounter him in Mount Coronet, he doesn't even give you his name or doesn't even say that he's a part of the team. He keeps everything very low-key and very tight. And Team Galactic at its core is a really good research firm. They were able to analyze the locations of all 3 of the lake trios and successfully capture all 3 of them to use them in their plot to get the attention of Dialga and Palkia. And by using the gems of the 3 lake guardians, he's successfully able to capture those legendary space and time chain gods, which by the way in Pokemon Platinum he only gets one chain and is able to use his team's resources to create a second artificial chain. And although his plans fell in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, in Platinum he actually manages to get dragged into the Distortion world and stays there where he resides in the lonely world that he so desires. But yes, this most definitely would take a ton of funding to do, which is why I think that he arguably could have been higher on the tier list, but the options above are just a cut above. Now coming in at the final tier list, the 1% corporations, the large corporations, the ones that would be on the freaking S&P 500 if they were real. The first entry on the list is Team Plasma. And it's a bit of a strange pick to put it here, but I ultimately landed it here just because of their Gen 5 Part 2 version, where instead of being like this cult-like following, they just take the mask off and truly reveal their intentions of taking over the Unova region in the world afterwards. I think the biggest evidence that they have like really good funding is their recruitment of the infamous researcher Colorus, which by himself was able to develop a weapon that could freeze over the Unova region by using Kyurem's power, which in itself is a pretty noble feat, especially considering that it's a man-made weapon that harnesses a power of one of the legendary Pokemon of the Unova region. And I'm not gonna lie to you, that probably is expensive as hell. Definitely more expensive than capturing 3 lake legendaries that aren't even the box cover ones. And although they steal Pokemon and also stole the DNA splicers, without a doubt they built most of the stuff, including that gigantic ship that is basically their mobile base. And that alone eclipses like any other costly base on this tier list from any team that is below this. I mean, they have a ship that can house and feed all of their team members. It has doctors on board, it has multiple levels to it, it has a power generator, it has a room that can hold a Kyurem, and those ships are not really that cheap to manufacture. I mean, I would imagine that ship costs more than the US carriers that cost $13 billion to make. And that's like the strongest argument for them being placed in the highest tier alongside of the rest of the entries on this. Next on our list we have Team Flare. And what I think puts Team Flare above Team Plasma is the fact that honestly their leader is kind of like the Steve Jobs of the Pokemon world in the sense of he created the Holocast. Not only that, but he is a well-known researcher that is acknowledged by the likes of Professor Sycamore and even the champion of the Kalos region. And also, he uses his amassed wealth to also host one of the biggest podcast / news stations in the Kalos, while also having one of the Elite Four members at Kalos on his payroll. And he also has a lot of influence outside of the Kalos region because Holocast is really big in the Alola region and also the Hoenn region, in Omega Ruby, Alpha Sapphire, and Sun and Moon. This shows that Team Flare definitely has a lot of money in the bank and is one of those top tier corporations in the Pokemon world, but it's definitely not number one. Up next was my original number one, but then I did some research into the one I was going to put number 2, and surprisingly they passed them up by a wide margin. This is none other than Team Rocket, which was originally going to be number 1. Which, unlike the other teams, Team Rocket is influential in 2 regions, the Kanto and the Johto region, which separates them from most teams on this list. The way they primarily get their money is by stealing others' Pokemon and selling them on the black market, which is actually really huge in Pokemon because we've seen in multiple iterations of it, even though I'm focusing solely on the game, that the black market is actually a massive industry in Pokemon. Not only that, but Giovanni is also siphoning off funds from the Pokemon League, as he is the 8th and strongest gym leader in the Pokemon games, even though he is absent. Like, Team Rocket low-key be gatekeeping people from beating the Pokemon League, but hey. Anyways, just by looking at Giovanni, you can tell he's definitely a man that stands on business and knows what he's doing to fund his organization, so much so that in the Johto games, Team Rocket seems lost without him. Besides that, Team Rocket is known to have funded the research for Mewtwo, and also they own the game corner that's in Celadon City in the Kanto region, which those 2 alone are very much evidence that they bring in and have a lot of money on hand to fund things like these. I mean, it's already an incredible feat that they caught Mew in the first place, something that most organizations can't even dream of doing. They are also known to be very tech savvy. They invented an invention that could force the evolution of a shiny Magikarp into a Gyarados without having to use the level requirement just by sound frequency alone. They also have a hideout in Johto with multiple floors as well as Kanto with multiple floors, which both of those probably cost very high amounts of money. And I also forgot to mention, there is an iteration of Team Rocket called Team Rainbow Rocket where they successfully took over the world and expanded beyond the scope of that one timeline. And I'm not going to mention that solely because it's too speculative, but if you want to put it at number 1 because of that, I wouldn't blame you, because he did manage to get all previous team leaders under his one banner, which that is a really crazy feat. But anyways, Team Rocket will be placed at number 2, and Rainbow Rocket could be placed at number 1, but that's up entirely to you. But moving on to my number 1, it is the Aether Foundation. Yes, the Aether Foundation is stacked with cash, and it's crazy the amount of stuff that they fund and the amount of stuff that they do just in the Alola region. They have other branches. See, the Aether Foundation's main goal is to treat harmed Pokemon, which you could use that to interpret the fact that they may fund all of the Pokemon centers inside of the Alola region, which wouldn't be too speculative based on that objective. And they also funded the creation of artificial Pokemon to fight the Pokemon that come from said pocket dimensions. But whenever that went rogue, they managed to come up with an invention that would cryo freeze the Pokemon that they made in the first place. So they managed to contain the Pokemon, unlike Team Rocket. On top of that, they have a scientist that managed to create and fund a new Pokeball to capture those Pokemon from the other dimensions that they wanted to help. And in terms of things that they actually own, they basically created that whole artificial island, which if you look at like real artificial islands, you would know that that takes quite literally billions of dollars to do. Like, not millions, billions. And they're also pretty noteworthy of an organization. And I know I'm not going to use other media, but it's worth noting that Team Rocket and Master CX wanted to steal some research from the Aether Foundation, and Colress as well acknowledges the Aether Foundation as being a pretty notable asset in the Pokemon universe. And these are just things that we've seen in the Alola region, because it was implied that there are multiple branches of the Aether Foundation around the Pokemon world, which is pretty crazy considering that they build all of this high-tech and fancy stuff in the Alola that costs way more money than the next teams did. But with that, we definitely can seal the Aether Foundation as being the number 1 funded team inside of the Pokemon universe, which definitely explains why Team Skull got the short end of the stick. I mean, how can you compete with such a massive behemoth of a corporation? But anyways, it's gonna wrap up the list of the evil teams that are well funded and the ones that really aren't. Team Yell. And if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and stick around, because next time I'm going to do the richest to poorest regions in the Pokemon universe. But anyways, I don't know.